Hello, this is Bob McClellan. In this screencast, I will be demonstrating how to configure rows, columns, filters, and data values in a pivot table. The example is an extension of my previous pivot table examples, but I won't be showing much of the older parts since there are previous screencasts to show that. But I'll go over them briefly. If you want details about those earlier parts, just go back to parts 1 through 3 in my blog. So this screencast will be divided into two sections. In the first, I will be showing how to use the example code, and in the second, I'll show you the details of how the XML is created and coded to create the results that work for the configurations. First, in order to get the code example, in case you haven't seen this before, you go to powertools.codeflix.com to the downloads page, and then scroll down to find the latest version of the PowerTools core. Version 2.2.5 includes the code that I'll be showing today. So first, let's see what it looks like when it's done. I'm going to go ahead and run so you see what I'm trying to create here. And it creates this new pivot. You can ignore these style changes, that's for a different example. And there's my pivot table with two fields in the columns, two fields in the row, a page or filter field, and of course the data value. I don't know if I can move this. Yeah, let's see if we can see a little more in here. There you can see all the different values. Oh, I moved it again. I'm going to move this here. Yeah. So that you can see all the different fields that are in the 4 different sections there. Okay, so I'll close that and go back to show you how this is done. This is an example I've been using for a lot of stuff. And there's a whole bunch of style stuff in here that I've done elsewhere. But skipping that, what's happening here is the new spreadsheet is created. We add a worksheet that contains the original data. Let's skip down through here. This is the part that loads it from a text file. And then this is the part where we actually set up the pivot. So the contents are set, then a range. The new pivot table worksheet is created, and then there's a create pivot table, which actually creates all the pieces needed for a pivot table. And then the new part are these add pivot axis and add data value methods, when those are setting up each field. So you can see I have 2 columns, 2 rows, a data value, and a page, which is the filter. And then it saves it. And that's all you need to know in order to create the spreadsheet you just saw. So I'm going to open it up again real quick. If you see, we have year and quarter in the columns. And there's year and quarter in the columns. Then category and product in the rows. So there's category and product, and then here's my region, north and south in there. Okay, so, and then of course the amount is the data value. So that's all there is to using the example code. But now I'm going to go on into the second section and talk about how I was able to do this, how the XML is set up for a pivot table. This time I'm going to show a little bit about how I decided what needed to be done here. So I created this little test one, which it looks exactly the same, but I created it in Excel. Let's see if I can open it here. See, it looks the same, but I originally created this in Excel so that I could see what it looked like, what kind of XML values needed to be in there in order to do this configuration. So I'm opening it up in the editing tool, the document editing tool in Visual Studio, so I can see the parts that are in there. And I wanted to look at the pivot table and see. I'm going to do this Control-ED to format it down. And I saw these parts with the axis column and the items, axis page, axis row, the data field, and then I noticed, after that, all those parts, then there's these row fields part, and I can see, okay, that matches the two that are axis rows, and looks like it sets the order that they appear. In this case, it happens they're in the same order, 3 and then 4. And then there's all these row items, and I looked at the spec for row items, and this is pretty complicated stuff. But what it's doing is essentially creating these little hierarchies with the plus minus so that I can collapse and open them. So then I went on, looked at call fields. There's the column fields, and this call items is again that little hierarchy thing. And then I have the page fields, data fields. And so one of the things I wondered is what would happen if I took those out. So I'll go back to the editor here. Are they really needed? Does Excel really need those to open this pivot table? So I'll just go in here and take them out. Make sure everything's lined up right. I'll save it. And that's my test. So I'm going to go and open it. And look. Oh, the little pluses and minuses are gone. But otherwise it's there. So I'll go ahead and refresh. And sure enough, it just puts them back in there. So I don't think I need to go to the trouble of creating those as long as I can refresh the spreadsheet, which I'll need to do anyway. I really need to force a refresh after I configure this anyway. So I'm hoping I'll be able to do that, and of course it turns out I can. But I wanted to just show that sometimes you can simplify quite a bit just by doing a little testing. Now, that said, you need to also be aware that different versions of Excel may not be as accepting in the same way. Some future version could come and not be happy with that being missing, but it looks pretty good. That made it a lot easier because I didn't have to do those items inside there. Now these items here with the x equals, what those are referring to are parts of the cache. In the cache definition, whenever we have shared items, these shared items are always set up for any row, column, or filter / page fields that are configured. And it shows all the available values so that it knows what can appear. Because a lot of times those can repeat quite a bit. And so they're set up here so that they're not repeating a lot. That's the name shared items. And you can see there's five of these: year, quarter, region, category, and product. Those are my 5 axis or configured values on the columns, rows, and filters. And so we're going to need to make sure those get set up properly. And that is a large part of the code involved. And so then, once you have like the year, the 2 values for the year, then over here, what that's saying is, well, for the year column, there are 2 items. There's 0 index and 1 index, which refers to the 2010 and 2011. And then the default refers to the total columns, which are the 2010 and 2011 total. But it turns out that's always there. Each one has a default, so there's not too much to worry about there. So with that in mind, let's see how it's coded. So, oh, there's the example. And then here are the calls. So, as I said, the create pivot table I've talked about before. That's going to create all the pivot fields and cache fields. Well, they're pivot cache records, pivot cache definitions, and the pivot table itself. So that part hasn't changed from the previous example that I've done. Now here's the add pivot axis, which is the most important new one. And I have this little enum set up so that it knows which axis it's creating, because a lot of it's the same for all three. So I'm passing in the document that I'm going to operate on, the sheet containing the pivot table, and in this case I am assuming there is only one pivot table. It's possible to put more than one into a sheet, but just for simplicity of the example, I just assume there's only one that I need to work on. Then the field name that I want to add as a axis, and then the type of axis. So the first thing that needs to be done here is to create those indexed items I was talking about in the cache and the pivot table itself. First, I've got to get that pivot table part from the sheet, and I'm just getting the first one, as I said. Then I'm going to, from that, I can get the cache definition, and there should only be one of those in the pivot table. So I can do the first on that. And then the cache has a records part, and I can just get the first one of that. Now I need that records part because I'm going to go through that and find all the unique values to put into the cache definition. And that's what I'm going, the next part right here. I get the X document for that cache definition. And then I'm going to find the one that matches the field name. That gives me the index in this neat little expression with the find index on an array. Then I get the records part, and now I'm going to start building a list of all the unique values. So I create a simple little list object there for the X elements of those values. And then I have my loop where I'm going through all the records, and I can index in for the field that I'm interested in to get its value. And then I'm looking up which index it is in my value list. If it's not there, I add it. And then I'm going to replace the element with a reference. So if we look at the records, I didn't show this before, but if I look at the records, once I've done this shared items, I can actually replace them all. So you can see there's just a bunch of these X values and then the N for the amount. And so it really does cut down the space a lot. And so for a large number of records, this could really reduce the size quite a bit. And so it's replacing each one of those original values, which were strings, with these references to the shared items. So going back to the code here. So I'm replacing those as I go. And then I'm going to find the proper shared items for that field and add the count and my list of values that I've created that references it. It turns out that list of values is the exact same element names as were in the cache records, so that makes that really pretty simple to do. And then I'm going to write out both the records and the cache definition because those have both changed. That's what a putX document does. It doesn't actually write it to the file yet, that's just doing it in memory. Then we need to add the definition to the pivot table itself. So I'm getting the document for the pivot table part. And then I'm finding the right pivot table, the matching pivot table based on the name that I've indexed up above. And then I'm doing this part where I build the items list. I'll go back to, I'm going to close these now since here's the pivot table part. See that items list with the count and item X, and a default at the end. So I'm building all those item X and the counts. And the way I do that is create the count attribute with the number there, and it'll be one larger because it's going to have that default added at the end. And then I also noted when I looked at these examples that the items are sorted alphabetically. So like here for the last one down here that has 6 items, it shows 0, 1, 2, 4, 3, and that's because those products are slightly different order if you sort them alphabetically. The one above that where it shows 1 and 0, those are the it's accessories and bicycles, but in the original code, bicycles always comes before accessories, so that's in the opposite order. So I wanted to match that, and so they would show in alphabetical order in the pivot table, as is normally the way. And so I order it based on the value, and then I use the select to basically transform the original values into new item elements, and then add the default at the end. Now once that's created, I need to, let's just go back here a minute. I'm going to actually adjust the pivot field by adding this axis attribute and the items underneath it, but that axis value is going to be different. So at this point is where I switch on the different types. And also, once I've added, even though after I've done the pivot field, I've also got to update the row fields, call fields, or page fields, depending on which one of those it is as well. So that's what this different case parts here are. So for the column, I'm adding it as axis call, and then going through this process of updating the call fields element, but I need to create it if it hasn't been in there before, which is the case when the first one is done. And this is one of those situations where Excel likes those things in a certain order, and I didn't try all the different permutations of what order they could be in, so I just matched the way it normally stores them. So this little part here is looking to see what elements are already in there so that it places in the right order. And then at the end, adding in the new field and updating the count once it knows which one it's doing. And the row is very similar, just slightly different properties or element names. It does the same sort of thing. It's also a little easier to determine where it should be inserted because it's more higher up in the list. And then the page one, which is also could be called a filter, it's a little more different from the others. The names of the items underneath, if you look here, like row fields and call fields use field X, which is the same for both of those, but page fields uses page field and an FLD, so it's a little different. So each of those sections just does the right thing to match that XML. Then we update the pivot table part with that modified document. And then there's this nice little force pivot refresh, which is going to cause the pivot to automatically update with the new configuration, and that gets our plus minus things in there and everything, so everything's up to date. I'll show that in a moment. The add data value is actually fairly similar and a little simpler because it doesn't have to do that all this item stuff. It doesn't have all the items. Instead, it just adds the data fields part at the bottom. Oh, and if we look at right there, the pivot field needs to be updated with the data field true or 1. So those are the only two parts that need to be done there. So I look at, again, I'm looking at the pivot table part and the cache definition. I need the cache definition so I can get the index of which field I'm updating. That's the only place where the field name appears. Then I'm going to get the document for the pivot table, find that pivot field, add that data field through. Then I have this whole positioning thing again where I have to figure out where that new data fields element needs to go within the order of things. And other than that, I'm just then adding in an element into that data field, and I put the little sum of in front and set all the other values, and then write out that X document. And again, I'm going to make sure that force pivot refresh is set. And this is just the force pivot refresh is a value on the cache definition part that just says refresh on load, and I'm just looking to see if it's already there. Then I set it to 1, and if it's not there, then I add it with a value of 1, and then write that out. And so that'll force it to automatically refresh on the load. And that is all the code. And that is it. That gets your lovely pivot table result that you can configure the way you want. I hope you find this useful, and if there are any pieces missing that you would like me to show or cover or expand on, then just comment on my blog post. Thank you.